Well, hello. I'm sorry, we appear to have had some little technical hitches there, so I'll just reintroduce the session. A very warm welcome to you to this DDU e-webinar. You're all very welcome. Grateful to you for giving up your lunchtime. We hope you'll find this format valuable and we won't have any further glitches. As part of a sort of a balanced range of CPD, going to have an interactive session. You'll see there's a chat box on the right of your screen. You'll see the red arrow there. Gives you an opportunity to contribute. We'll ask you a few questions as we go along. You can ask questions and make points as we go through the presentation. We've got lots of members of the wider dental team here. Have a look at the session in your role. Have a look, see how you think you can contribute to complaints handling within your practice, because it's very much a team effort. So very welcome everyone is. I'm going to switch to the presentation now and we'll begin. So the presentation is very much intended to be a positive presentation. We're going to give you some practical risk management tips and ideas, certainly not intended to go into the minutiae of every aspect of the complaints procedures and the regulations. There simply isn't time here. But the fine detail of those things is certainly available on DDU's website, and we obviously invite specific questions from our members via our advice line, and each dental legal advisor, of course, will give you bespoke advice in respect of any matter with which we're assisting our individual members. I think we can perhaps start with a bit of a myth buster, really, that yes, although complaints are on the increase, it's commonly thought these days that patients are very ready to complain, and they'll complain at the drop of a hat. The reality is quite different from that, and I think we can give ourselves something of a pat on the back in that, you know, if you think how many dentist-patient interactions there are in a given day, in a given week, in a given year, the number of complaints relative to that is actually comparatively small, and I think we should take a positive from that. Having said that, certainly complaints are on the increase. There's a wide range of reasons for that, and we'll touch on some of those as we go through. I think one thing to say is that you know, the public does trust us and does have confidence in us generally. Some of you may have seen the recent Which report, and things like that unfortunately can tend to undermine public trust and public confidence. But on a very positive note, if you ask a survey or ask individual patients, what about your dentist, then there's a very, very high score of people who trust their dentist, and you know, even if they've got a sort of different view of us more widely, certainly we instill trust within our own patients, and that rapport is something that's hugely important in treating patients and avoiding complaints and dealing with them as we go along. So important to build that rapport as well. Often underlying complaints can be very minor things that sort of build one on top of the other, and ultimately there can be something really quite simple that may precipitate a complaint. So it's important that that we're mindful of little things that go along and may well go unnoticed within the practice, can actually add up and contribute to problems later on. So let's have a little look at what we're going to have a look at as we go through the presentation. What we're going to have a little look at today is, you know, why is it important to get it right? You know, so that we see, you know, what's going on then, and key things there are obviously if we can close things down at an early resolution stage at the lowest possible level, then we're going to limit the sort of collateral damage that goes with that. In terms of a business perspective, you know, businesses actually sometimes will look for feedback, and it actually can be quite a positive thing, and we can sometimes regard it as an opportunity, and we can build our practices on the basis of good complaint handling sometimes, because we can certainly learn from those. But if we don't get it right, it's very stressful, it's very time-consuming, so key, and we'll look at that shortly as we go through as well. The next thing we're going to look at is, what is a complaint? It might seem hugely obvious to us, but a complaint may seem very, very obvious to us, but actually it's very easy to miss them, and sometimes it can be very readily overlooked, and with hindsight we can actually look back and see that we've missed the early signs. So we'll look at that as well. How should we respond? Well, it's very easy to get it wrong and often sort of decide in haste and repent at your leisure. It can be very, very easy to respond in anger sometimes if we're really upset by a complaint. And it's important to take one's time and be circumspect about things and avoid the rapid response. And the direct opposite of that, of course, is burying one's head in the sand and hoping the thing will go away, because invariably it's simply going to escalate. And the final thing we're going to look at is arguably the absolute key point, is how we jolly well avoid the things in the first place. So looking through, in 2013-14, you'll see on the screen there the number of complaints that were notified to DDU by our members. And it's one of the main, in fact it's probably the main reason our members get in touch with us. And we thought it'd be interesting to have a look at the split between clinical treatment and what we might call service issues, front of house type issues, peripheral to clinical treatment. And this is where we're going to involve you in the process, and we're going to ask you to have a little look and see what proportion you think of those complaints will be split between clinical treatment and the service issues. So if you go to your red arrow and have a look at the poll now, the poll's now open. So if you have a little vote and see from those questions which of those four options you think is the more likely. See, the results are coming in now, so you're quick off the mark now. Okay, so there we are. So what I can see here is that pretty much, let's have a look. I think we can bring up those results, can't we? Two-thirds of you think that actually these are related to non-clinical service issues, and I may have misled you by the way I introduced there, because I sort of tempted you into that one, I think. But actually, it's about a third. So two-thirds relate to clinical matters, and a third to what we might call purely service issues. Obviously, there's always going to be some crossover between the two, and as I said right from the outset, obviously there are quite commonly multifaceted things, and sometimes the service issue can precipitate a complaint about the clinical stuff, and yeah, well, you kept me waiting, but not only that, but that, and sometimes vice versa. Interestingly, the GDC's just published some statistics recently, which they've made public, and you may have seen this, and this is the GDC mapping, if you like, complaints to standards. So slightly different criteria to those that we've just used, but if you look at the sort of the light purple box there, professional knowledge and skills, and the brown box, they probably, the slice, they probably relate to the clinical stuff crudely. So you'll see that actually the GDC stats pretty much map what we're finding. So why is it important to get it right? Well, quite clearly, we do have a GDC obligation to deal with complaints and provide patients with an appropriate explanation, and if appropriate, an apology. You'll see quite often when you get correspondence from NHS complaints departments, it'll suggest pretty much that an apology is mandatory. Well, quite often we can apologise that the patient has felt the need to complain. It doesn't that approach doesn't quite recognise the fact that occasionally there are purely vexatious complaints. But in general terms, it does us no harm to say, I'm sorry you were dissatisfied, because that doesn't in any way infer that we're accepting liability or that we actually feel we've done anything wrong. But no one likes to see unhappy patients, so it does no harm to approach it in that kind of empathetic way. Patients do expect a prompt and constructive response, and you'll see that if you look at the GDC standards, it's actually reasonably prescriptive in terms of the fact that you ought to follow the NHS complaints procedure if it's an NHS complaint, and I think it terms it, of a similar nature if it's a private setup. So along similar lines is often a good idea. And the bottom one there talks about the spectre of multiple jeopardy, and we'll see what we mean by that in a minute. But I think the non-clinical matters are simply things like communication skills, breach of confidence, removal from practice lists, waiting times, all sorts of stuff that can crop up there. So in terms of multiple jeopardy, what do we mean by that? Well, a simple complaint can actually manifest itself in a number of different ways, and unfortunately often in more than one way. So if we look, for example, at a complaint about NHS treatment, in the top red box there, we can see that would normally be dealt with at local resolution. So as we've said, we'd very much aim to deal with that at a local practice level, or sometimes through the NHS England or the Health Board, and we might receive correspondence that way. And we do obviously our level best to deal with that at that local stage. There are certain set ways of dealing with that. Obviously, we'd be wanting to acknowledge the complaint normally within 3 working days, and generally speaking, we'd aim to be offering a response within 10 working days. If things are going to take longer, and there are lots of reasons why they might do, a key thing is to keep patients up to date. No one likes to be ignored, and if patients feel that we're not addressing their complaints, they're much more likely to escalate them. So there's no harm in keeping patients informed, even if it's just to say we're just waiting for some records to be forwarded to us or whatever it is, which might mean that there's a short delay. And as you'll see, occasionally, unfortunately, local resolution doesn't deal with the problem, and at the end of that process, we might be in a position where we need to signpost the patient to the Ombudsman, as we are required to do, and then the Ombudsman might investigate their residual concerns. Interestingly, occasionally people will go directly to the Ombudsman, and the first thing you'll receive is a letter to say, has the matter been dealt with at local level? And sometimes they'll refer it back for you to do so if not. Private complaints dealt with in a similar way. There's perhaps ought to be another bullet point there, obviously, for local resolution. Dental complaints service is there. It's not part of the GDC. It's funded, obviously, through your annual retention fee. It's an arm's length body, but boy, they certainly know the GDC's phone number. So DCS is generally aimed to be very helpful, and as a sort of an honest broker, if you like, between the parties. But occasionally, if they do feel there's a fitness to practice issue, then it's entirely possible that they may refer the matter on. And obviously, if the matter goes to a disciplinary situation, there may be a performers list issue, and there can sometimes be local panels looking at whether there are any performance issues, etc. And all these things can be running concurrently. And the last thing we really want to see, but unfortunately it's something that's on the increase, is a complaint to the GDC. And sadly we're seeing an increase in complaints to the GDC and directly to the GDC. Now, it's difficult to know what the real cause of that is. It may just simply be that because of technology, people's access to the relevant information and websites and web links and all the rest of it just simply means that they can readily hit the CC button. And that's why it's important that we manage that very carefully, as we'll come to later. Because once, under the current rules, and you'll see if you look at the website, you can all fill in a postcard and send it off to the Minister to urge the government to bring in the Section 60 order, which will help us to, or help the GDC to amend its own procedures so that they're not so cumbersome and slow and taking, you know, more than a year sometimes to go through that process. Obviously, patients can bring a claim in negligence, and that would go through the civil courts, and it would be for the patient to prove negligence, and that's when they seek damages in negligence. Occasionally, criminal matters, so if there's an allegation of an assault or an inappropriate touching or something of that nature, there could be criminal issues, and occasionally, obviously, if there's been a death and that's related to dentistry in any way. So, for example, the cause of death on the death certificate says dental sepsis, then obviously that's going to be something that's going to trigger the coroner's inquest. So lots of ways that complaints can manifest themselves. So here we are, we're all in our surgeries, minding our own business, as we've been doing all morning. You guys are morning at the enamel face, and a lot of you be in that situation. And if you look around perhaps the waiting rooms or the surgeries where your computer is located, you'll look up and you'll see one of these posters. I shan't ask you to comment, and won't have any red faces for anyone who doesn't have this on display. And this actually lists the 9 principles, and we'll see there loud and clear at number 5 is that we are required to have a clear and effective complaints procedures. So there's no escaping that, there's no getting away from that. Unlike one of the FDs I was talking to recently who said that it's causing all sorts of trouble, so he thinks number 5 should be deleted. I'm afraid that's not going to happen anytime soon. It's difficult to argue with any of those 9 points when we look at them, but you know, we need to be mindful of them and make sure we comply. And the reason that that's on all our waiting room walls is because of this. In the GDC Standards and in the preamble as well, you'll see that it defines the word should and must. Must means must, and should means must other than in exceptional circumstances. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't imagine what exceptional circumstances there might be that would preclude one from displaying this poster on one's waiting room wall. It might be a drawing pin shortage or something like that, but other than that, it's quite difficult to imagine. So that's up there, and patients are aware of it, and patients know what it is. So, you know, on to define what a complaint actually is. You know, we might think it's really quite obvious, but it's not defined anywhere in the regulations, and it's really for us to interpret. The key thing is to recognise them and recognise them at an early stage. Now, it's a team game, and we all understand that quite often, you know, as dentists we'll see a patient in the surgery, but it's when the patient goes out to reception, it's the poor receptionist or practice manager who often will either get both barrels or quiet disgruntlement, as I would call it, that it's just patients hinting that they're dissatisfied. So it's key that we recognise them, and it's important on that sort of team basis that we communicate as a team. If I'm, you know, in my surgery and reception feel that there's something that this patient's unhappy about, I really want to know about that, and we'll come on to that later on because that's absolutely fundamental. So team approach to that. And it can be something as simple as you know, a catastrophic failure of treatment that the patient feels you know, there's some fault there, or it can be as simple as, you know, you always keep me waiting. So lots of reasons, but there's the definition, and it's a simple one. Key thing there is that I would say is, in my view, not what it says, but what it doesn't say. What it doesn't say is, it doesn't say a written expression of dissatisfaction. And that's a mistake that is commonly made, to assume that if a complaint isn't in writing, then it isn't a formal complaint, it doesn't require a response. And you know, if you think about it, if we were to deny patients the right to complain verbally, then some patients are illiterate and couldn't complain at all. So I think, you know, a verbal complaint is entirely valid. It should be noted at the time contemporaneously, and the complainant advised that it will be dealt with properly in the normal way. So that's a key thing, and obviously the requirement for a response is essential. So sometimes simple comments and concerns at reception, as we've said, can be immediately apparent, but not necessarily to the clinical members of the team. So it's important that as a team we do train and empower our frontline staff both to deal with the sort of stuff that can be dealt with at that level. So you always keep me waiting, you know, it happens every time I come. You might simply say, well, here's a practical thing, perhaps we could offer you the 9 o'clock appointment or the 2 o'clock appointment, because, you know, we'd always be running on time then, and emergencies won't have, or running late won't have happened. So sometimes practical tips, and if one can deal with that, you know, in under 24 hours, make a note of it, then that's done and dusted, and we can avoid invoking the full complaints procedure as we can see here. So if you look at section 5 of your GDC standards, it does require that you have a complaints procedure in place, and it's worth going through that as a team to see what the provisions for that is. It's reasonably prescriptive, actually. So we are required to have a complaints procedure in place, and normally when we acknowledge a complaint, we would send a copy of that to the patient, which is a good idea, because it gives them an indication of how their complaint will be dealt with, and what the process is. As we've said, sometimes an honest response on the spot can be, you know, I'm sorry we kept you waiting, here's a practical solution, and that's that. Obviously matters of a sort of deeper complexity may need some investigation. It may need that the clinical records will need to be reviewed. It may be that staff will need to be interviewed, and then therefore that should be fully done, and patients notified that that's going to happen, and then obviously the findings communicated. So in terms of how we respond, you know, we're going to wake you up again and see what you think about this. So we're going to open the floor to you now, and we're going to ask you to indicate, again via the same means, what you think it is that patients are looking for. So what do complainants want? Partly why do they complain, but what do they actually want from us? So we've got 1 or 2 responses coming in now. An apology. Yeah, that's certainly one of the things that people are looking for. That's cropping up. An explanation, certainly. To be listened to and taken seriously. Thank you, Ruth. Absolutely. And, you know, apologies cropping up all the time. To be heard, recognition. Make sure the mistake doesn't happen again to anyone else. That's a really important point, because patients are really quite often quite altruistic, and you know, they're not always. It's interesting that very few of you, or if any actually, have said that they're looking for money, and I think you're right. I think they often are looking to understand, they're looking for an acknowledgement of their feelings, they're looking to be heard, etc. And sympathy, empathy, I think is quite an important word. So someone does think they might want a refund, and that might be a solution sometimes, but it's not necessarily always the case. And they want honesty and sincerity. GDC, actually, the fitness to practice guidance actually does acknowledge that treatment won't always have a successful outcome, and sometimes by definition we do need to explain that there. So there we are. You're all absolutely on the button. Certainly an explanation is one of them. To feel heard, and an apology. I mean, I think these were the top ones that you all were sending in there. Occasionally remedial treatment and or costs, improvements to the service. Again, that sort of altruism kicking in there, that patients want to know it's not going to happen to them, their friends, their family, and sometimes people just genuinely feel part of the organisation. If you look at GP surgeries, they've got patient focus groups and all sorts of stuff, and they have a sense of belonging sometimes, and they do want to positively contribute to an improvement. So willingness to right wrongs, ownership of that complaint, and to understand the process. So I think you're all really absolutely spot on with those points that you were making there. So thank you for those. I think the key thing not to do really, and is to sort of trivialise matters, to deny it. No one else has ever complained, and certainly I think one of the key things is to remember that at the early stage, if we respond, that correspondence may well rear its ugly head further on down the track if the complaint has legs and certainly if it's escalated. So it's really very important that we don't compound matters by in any way being seen to sort of mislead patients by not giving them an honest and frank response at the outset, because that can actually lead to further allegations and worsening of matters later on. We're not seeking to blame patients. Well, I mean, there may be some facts in the matter. Well, you cancelled all your hygienist appointments, therefore it's difficult to improve your perio. But we're not looking to blame patients. You never use the furry end of the toothbrush, or you're always failing your appointments, etc. It's explanations, and it's a positive approach, and we don't want excuses. Patients, as you've quite rightly highlighted, want a sort of frank and honest approach. If we make things unnecessarily complicated and give them huge stages and hurdles to leap through, they can very quickly become disgruntled and can very readily escalate their cases. So, we want to deal with it obviously properly and with due process, but as expeditiously as we possibly can. And the last thing again that they need is a jargon-filled letter. Be very careful, when we respond that we're not baffling the patient with science. They want to hear it like it is, and it can be quite ironic sometimes, really, that the patient says we haven't explained things properly, and that's their complaint, and then we go and do exactly the same again in responding. So absolutely key that we don't do just that. Keep it simple. So the next thing we really want to have a look at is how do we respond? What are we going to say in responding? So these are the key points. Empathy, putting yourself in the patient's shoes. Really very important that we do just that and understand it from their perspective. There's absolutely no harm in saying, I can really fully appreciate how awful that weekend must have been when that endo blew up. It doesn't mean that we're in any way accepting that it was necessarily our fault, but patients want us to understand where they're coming from, really, and we might not regard as a lost crown as an emergency, but again, in that patient's shoes, from a social perspective, it jolly well is if they've got an important business meeting or whatever. So that's how we can show that we really care about our patients and understand how they feel. Absolutely key that you contact us and seek our advice at an early stage. A number of reasons for that. We can, with our experience of seeing lots of these things, we can actually see the pitfalls along the way and give you strong advice as to how to avoid those. So don't ever hesitate to pick up the phone and seek our advice, even at an early stage. And again, a key thing is, as we've already said, not to blame patients. I'm sorry you're unhappy, but this is the reason for that. Involve colleagues. Seek an objective view from someone who isn't quite so closely involved. Quite often, if we've been dealing with this patient for a long time, sometimes we can't quite see the wood for the trees. So colleagues can be really important. Address all the points in the complaint as well. It's very easy to deal with points 1 to 4 of 6 and either miss out the 2 harder ones or just overlook them. And you can be sure that the patient's going to really pick up on that and just come back with yes, but what about this, what about that? And that just takes up more of your time, and sometimes they might think you're trying to be evasive if they do. Key point from the feedback you sent in there is to state the learning points and any changes that have ensued, because sometimes the remedy that people want, as you've all quite rightly said, is to make sure it's not going to happen again and there's not going to be a recurrence. We'll touch on this later on, but sometimes an appointment to meet with patients can work and can disarm things very nicely. You know, we meet with our patients, we explain things to them in person all the time, so why not in complaints? You know, we don't give them oral hygiene advice by post, so, you know, why not meet with them and try to explain, and that way we can use radiographs, etc., to demonstrate things, and it's a much more personal way of dealing with it. And these are the things not to do, of course, is panic. Whatever you do, avoid the temptation to embellish the notes or whatever, because any such you know, activity would simply give rise to an allegation of dishonesty, which is almost certainly going to be worse than the very complaint itself. So you know, that's the last thing we want to be doing. And you know, never criticise colleagues as well. Quite often our members will ring us up and say, I'm really cross with the subsequent dentist who's clearly criticised me, and I want to pick up the phone and tell him or her what I think of them. Avoid that temptation, because a number of reasons really. It wouldn't be appropriate to do so in any event, because it's not in respect of, you know, communicating with them about a patient's treatment or whatever, put everyone in a difficult position. But not least because, as you know, patients can sometimes misinterpret what they've told, and sometimes, you know, with malintent, can actually misrepresent what they've been told. So never take absolutely at face value what a patient says the subsequent dentist has actually said. And quite often when we're dealing with complaints, we will in any event request the subsequent records to help us deal with them anyway. So that's why we shouldn't respond without seeing the notes. It might be your own notes actually if you've left the practice and moved on. And as it says, certainly we don't want to respond in haste and repent at our leisure. You'll see that there's a complicated scenario popping up here, and I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to read that. What I'd like you very much to do is pick out the key points from that you think this scenario raises. I'll give you a bit of a clue. There aren't too many words in there by accident. So just bullet points, pick out the key phrases, and we're going to ask you in a minute to send those in and let us know what you think they might be. So if you had that complaint in front of you, what do you think those key points might be? Okay, so just give you a moment to do that. Yep, so you're picking up on a couple of issues here. That the complaint is about the son but from the mother. No prior warning of treatment charges, consent's cropping up quite a bit. Charge for treatment that he felt should be free. 18-year-old patient should make the complaint himself. You've all spotted that one. Lack of clarity. Demeanour of the receptionist, yeah. Consent for the treatment, confidentiality at reception. Receptionist has encouraged a formal complaint. Thank you, Priya, for listening earlier on. Excellent. So, yeah, humiliating in front of others, receptionist behaviour, consent, charges, staff issues should have been sorted out verbally rather than making it into a formal complaint. So certainly we've got a lot of the key issues coming in there, so thank you for your engagement with that. I think what we're going to do is let's have a look through it and let's see what these key things are. So certainly many of you picked up on one of the initial points is that this is an 18-year-old patient and the letter of complaint comes from his mother. Now, it's not unusual that we'll get third parties doing that, and the way to address that and the way to deal with that is to simply let the complainant know that we do have a duty of confidentiality. We're unable to correspond with third parties about any patient or any details without even acknowledging that the patient is a patient. But then we would suggest very often that you contact the patient himself and give him the option to nominate his mother as his representative, or if he'd like us to address those concerns directly, then we can do that. So that's the first point, and most of you picked up on that. Interesting one that didn't crop up an awful lot is that it's a former associate of the practice. So the treating dentist is no longer in this practice. And that's something that we commonly see can generate a number of different issues. And I think it's really important that, to remember we are part of the community of practice, as I like to call it. It's an educational term, but it's a term I rather like. And we are there, as a community. It's not to suggest we cover up for each other if things are going wrong, and that's a whole different talk in itself. But we certainly don't want to do anything that would cause a complaint to go further. So, this associate has left the practice, and I think one of the key things that we might look at is what steps we might have taken to anticipate such an issue and have a plan of action in place as to how we would actually deal with this thing. So, why not? And obviously we can't deal with business and contractual matters purely, but quite commonly there would be an arrangement within an associate agreement whereby both parties would agree in advance how such things can be dealt with, so that, for example, if this treatment needed to be repeated or replaced or whatever, there'd be an arrangement between the parties behind the scenes as to how the costs might be dealt with and apportioned without the patient being involved, because patients neither know nor care what the financial arrangements are at the practice, and if they become in any way embroiled in such matters, then that just simply causes matters to escalate again. And again, a key point here is that this patient is in pain. So we don't want a situation where the practice ends up with a complaint because you focused on all the other issues but didn't deal with the difficulties that this patient was dealing with. So patient comes first. Dealing with the admin side of matters must always come second. Patient's best interest, GDC standard number 1. Again, number of issues here. We've got the consent issue. There might be certain very minor things that we would invite a patient to have done at an initial exam. If patient comes in and they've always had a scale and polish, they need a scale and polish, then clearly, it would upset them to send them away and bring them back for another, for another appointment to do one. But in certain circumstances, you've all picked up on the consent point, and it's good to give patients time to go away and think about things in this situation that have been time to provide the necessary paperwork, etc., so everyone understood where they were. So that's a key point, really, so the sort of speed with which this treatment was delivered. Now, interestingly, the complaint here would likely as not be forwarded to the associate for his or her attention in respect to the clinical aspects, but as you've pointed out, there's more than that going on here, and the practice would probably deal with, well, would need to deal with the matters relating to the staff, because obviously the practice employs the staff. So in this situation, if we've got an associate responding in respect to the clinical stuff and the practice responding about the administrative side of things, the non-clinical elements, then either that can be as a composite letter, or the practice could respond and say, I understand that Dr. Bloggs will reply about the clinical treatment. Okay, so that's how we would deal with that. So you can see that there are a number of factors in there that make that anything other than a simple thing to deal with. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on that one. So just in summary, most of the points we've covered. There's a confidentiality and consent issues. Patients want to know that yeah, yes, we're going to deal with it, but it's not going to delay matters. Who can complain? Well, obviously the patient themselves, someone who's been given authority. If the patient has died, it would be the executors, because there's still a duty of confidentiality due even when someone's died. And clearly, you know, people with legal parental responsibility, or if there's clear incapacity. And in those situations, you'd often be wanting to talk to us if you weren't sure. So in dealing with this, we look at all these different strands to it, and we'd certainly be seeking the input of the treating dentist. And these are going to include the key issues, all of the points that we want to include, highlight all of the areas of concern, as we said, so we don't miss anything, and we're going to say what's going to happen and why. So it may be, as I say, that we would meet with a complainant to address things, and it's a particular situation that colleagues are often a bit anxious about, really. And as I say, you know, no need to be, really, because although you know, the last thing we want to be doing is dealing with someone who's really cross with us, it's probably often the easiest way for us to explain things in detail, because just we've got those, not just the sort of you know, the communication skills that kick in when we actually meet people. We can use all those, and people can see our non-verbal skills, etc. as well. But there are certain little tips and ideas that we should agree, and you know, the last thing you want to do is book a particular time for a meeting and then find that the patient pitches up with, you know, half a dozen ring binders full of bullet points that they want to deal with at that point. So I think it's important to agree the parameters, just like any business meeting or a proper well-organized meeting, so everyone knows what's going to be discussed. It's good to invite patients to have someone along with them if needs be, because, you know, we would often want to have a witness to fact with us, so we'd have our nurse or our practice manager or someone with us simply as a witness to fact, and we don't want patients to feel outnumbered or bullied. So often a good idea to invite them to bring someone along as well. And we tend to find that if there are other people there, it can often take the sting out of things, and people often behave better when there are independent people there as well. So good news to do that. And sometimes there'll be, you know, the various bodies, CAP and all sorts of different ones, who may well bring along a sort of formal advocate with them. Sometimes an independent clinician can be helpful. So, you know, it might be a colleague from within the practice. You might think, well, you know, is the patient going to trust another colleague from within the practice? Remember what we said, they trust us as a profession in general, so why not? It might be a senior colleague, it might be someone the patient's already seen before and knows and trusts, and sometimes just hearing stuff in a different way from a different person can help with that explanation. So sometimes it can be appropriate to involve a supportive colleague, a supportive practice principal. Before any such meeting, always get in touch with us. We'll help you to prepare. We'll suggest one or two pitfalls. We'll suggest the limits of things, because, you know, there are times when a meeting's not going well and we need to know how to close it, when to close it, etc. So always get in touch with us, and we'll help you with some bullet points. And like as not, it's part of a complaint that we're dealing with you in any event. And a key thing of any proper process, and it goes to record keeping, etc., is to record and agree the minutes. And quite often that would be shared with the patient after the event, so that they can confirm that that's a fair record of what was done and said. Sometimes people want to sort of sound record a meeting, and again, that really is of concern to people. I don't have any particular issue with that, as long as it's far better that it's agreed and it's transparent and everyone has a copy than something to be done, you know, covertly on someone's smartphone. So no particular problems with it. As much as anything, you know, you've nothing to hide. You're going to explain things in a proper manner. So no particular problem with that. So, you know, these are the issues that we would do. What after that? Well, occasionally people will go away and have that sort of afterthought, and if needs be, perhaps we could always meet again. We don't want to allow this thing to go on and on and on, so there will be a point at which the complaint must be signed off, so to speak, and we say, well, look, we really have explained fully now. There's nothing further that we can add to the process. I'm sorry you're still dissatisfied, and that's when local resolution ends. And at that point, we're obliged to explain how a patient can seek independent review either by the Ombudsman or the Dental Complaints Service. And again, if sadly we reach that stage, you're almost certainly going to be seeking our advice as to how to manage that. So, how to avoid complaints? Well, that's probably one of the key areas of the whole thing, really. All of these really. Maintaining good communication from the outset and throughout. There's an American business guru who's attributed with the phrase, a guy called Tom Peterson, and he talks about under-promise and over-deliver, and that's obviously one of the main factors. It's not always easy to do, but if we are circumspect in what we promise, then it leads to patients less likely to be dissatisfied. And that leads directly into the number 2 there, which is to manage patients' expectations. First thing is to understand their expectations. Quite often we can get sort of carried away with what we know they need, but their perceived needs might be quite different to our sort of clinical knowledge-based needs. So it's important to manage their expectations, and manage their expectations in terms of what's possible, and not only that what's possible in general terms, but what's possible in respect of our own skills and abilities. We all know, we're good at some things and not at others, so that's where sometimes a referral will come in or whatever, or simply to say to a particular patient from the outset, I'm sorry, I really don't think that's possible, that's deliverable, can't meet your expectations. And I'd certainly rather deal with a complaint of politely declining to offer particular treatment for those reasons than to get halfway down the track and embark on treatment and then not be able to deliver it and have to sort of withdraw at that stage. Clinical records, well, we would say that, wouldn't we? Absolutely fundamental in every respect. It's a GDC requirement. Vast majority of GDC investigating committee stages will see there's a tag on and your records were inadequate in respect of this, that and the other. It's a requirement, it's good practice, it's in patients' interest, but as a very nice spin-off for you, good clinical records are the things that are going to best look after you. Now, I've got what I call my sort of hierarchy of evidence in this regard. If I'm helping you to respond to a complaint, then the ideal thing is for me to be able to say, via you, because I'll perhaps be drafting the letter for you, or one of my colleagues will, you've said this, that and the other, my records show that, and that's really powerful stuff, and sometimes we'll even send a copy of the My Records show to demonstrate that. If our records aren't quite as ideal as we would like, and this matter happened a week last Tuesday perhaps, the second thing in the hierarchy of evidence is to be able to say, well, it is my recollection that. So you can say, look, I remember our meeting, I remember explaining this to you, and certainly we can put that in a response. Not strong as the my records show that. In fact, the ideal is my records show that, and I recollect that. And finally, if it happened 3 years ago and our records are a bit threadbare, then we're having to say something. We're going to say something. So we'll say something along the lines of, it is my custom and practice too. So in other words, whenever I do this, this is what I do. This is what I would normally do. So that's the sort of thing we'd be saying. In terms of senior staff, certainly, it's very much a team game. So led from the top, but everyone's involved, and it's a continual improvement. And I think it's important that we can help people certainly prevent cases from developing, is if people are willing to help one another out. So if you look at 1.7.8 of the GDC Standards, it actually very clearly states that one shouldn't refuse to see a patient simply because they've complained. You know, it's not what the major department stores would do. They wouldn't ban you from the store and from their online shopping just because you've made a complaint. They try and resolve it and hope that you become an advocate for that business. And you know, by and large, that's what we ought to do as well. Obviously, certain exceptions where if a patient's abusive or whatever, then that's end of relationship. But sometimes a patient loses a bit of confidence in one particular practitioner and might wish to see another colleague, and quite often we'll see that people are really reluctant to do that. And that's a shame, because if we can keep things in-house, if we can avoid the patient going somewhere else where there might not be quite the same empathy and understanding of the situation and of how a colleague's dealt with things, then things are more likely to escalate. So if we can help one another out by taking on some of these patients and you know, giving a colleague a bit of support, you know, whilst at the same time being obviously transparent and honest with the patient, that can go an awfully long way to keeping complaints local. So supervision of the team and keeping an eye on things, how we're going. Guidelines, of course, you know, we need to be following proper protocols, and you know, patients are very switched on, and they'll quote the standards and the guidelines back to us quite often because they cut and paste from the web. So, you know, if we don't know the guidelines that we should be operating to ourselves, you know, we've got a bit of egg on our face when the patient quotes it back to us and says, well, what about this? So it helps us to, you know, avoid complaints, and it helps us to respond properly to them when they are received. Clearly, working within our competence and expertise, that partly goes to managing expectations. What can we do? What can we achieve? But we need to keep up to date as well, as the bottom one says, and the bottom two really go together. So we need to maintain our skills and abilities as dentistry develops, and you know, the whole range of the gambit of treatments that we can offer expands. And patients expect that of us. If you survey patients, one of the things they really strongly expect from us. So, you know, and know your limits, and sometimes if you set out on a treatment and it's not going as well as you might have hoped, then be prepared to take a step back and say, you know what, the outcome's not exactly as either of us would have wished. You know, we need to regroup, revisit. We might need to make a referral if needs be. And that's absolutely fundamentally important. Okay, so there we are, a whistle-stop lunchtime tour. Invite any questions in the last couple of minutes. As I say, we don't want patients beating your door down at 2 o'clock and saying you weren't available for me and I'm going to complain. But if there are a couple of questions, then be happy to take them. And obviously, any that we don't get to, you're more than welcome to pick up the phone and speak to us. So let's have a little look. What do we do if we've referred to a further provider and the patient's not happy with the treatment they received there? Well, to a great extent, if the patient's been happy to be referred, then that colleague would then be dealing with that complaint about that treatment. So that's how that goes. Is that we're responsible for our own treatment, as we said in our little scenario there, and you know, we deal with our own treatment. So you politely and respectfully refer them off there. And someone said, "Thank you, that's very nice. Thank you too. Thank you for staying with us." Maintain punctuality. I think that's one thing we need to do. And what will happen if our practice manager didn't alert us to the fact that we've received a complaint and we can't apologise in time? I think one of the things there is to agree with, if you work in a larger organisation, is to absolutely agree the principles under which you will be notified of complaints, and to go to your practice manager, go to your reception team, and empower them yourselves to say, please come to me, please do tell me if there's the merest hint of any dissatisfaction about what I'm doing. Because in so doing, next time the patient comes back in again, you can disarm that, and you can actually sometimes answer a complaint that the patient doesn't even realise they've made. So, you know, sometimes there are formal things within our contracts that say how complaints will be dealt with, but sometimes it's just having a chat with the team on the desk and say, let me know immediately you receive anything. I think we're going to close there at that stage. There's still one or two ones coming in, and we do need to stick to time, but we're delighted to receive any of these questions through the where can I get the post of the 9 principles, please? Have a look at the GDC website. We do need to close. Thank you very, very much for your attention. One or two colleagues saying thank you here, and hope you've enjoyed it, and look forward to meeting you the next time you come along. So see you shortly for